Big Shaq thought nothing could break his family, until the night his newborn granddaughter vanished from a hospital room, under his watch. As his daughter Layla lay trapped in a coma, a mysterious woman slipped into their lives and stole everything. In a world rigged against him, Shaq faces betrayal, racism, and a race against time. Some battles aren't fought in arenas, they're fought in broken hearts. And this time, Shaq isn't playing to win, he's fighting to survive. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun crowned Orlando with a rare kind of golden heat, the kind that made the sidewalks shimmer and the air pulse with life. It was a day made for celebration, and Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, felt it in his bones. The O'Neal family charity drive had drawn a lively crowd, politicians shaking hands, kids chasing balloons, and a steady thrum of music that made everything feel weightless. Shaq towered over the sea of people, laughing easily, his massive hands signing basketballs, sneakers, and t-shirts. No matter how much money he had or how many arenas he'd filled, Big Shaq never forgot who he was, a kid who once knew what it felt like to be overlooked, unheard, unseen. Today was extra special. His daughter Layla O'Neal, radiant at 8 months pregnant, had insisted on coming, saying she wouldn't miss seeing her father honored for anything. She floated through the crowd like light itself, her laughter tinkling over the microphone feed, as she joked with kids and posed for photos. She wore a simple yellow sundress, her long hair coiled into a loose braid. Happiness radiated from her, a golden aura as bright as the day itself. Big Shaq stood back and watched her, a lump in his throat. Life had knocked him around plenty, but seeing Layla strong, compassionate, fierce, was proof that maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right in this world. He placed a protective hand over her stomach, grinning when he felt the softest kick beneath his palm. It was a perfect moment. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything broke apart. Layla's smile faltered first, her body tensing like a wire pulled too tight. Her hand clutched her belly, her face twisting in a grimace. Shaq reached for her, but she was already crumbling, folding in on herself, sinking to her knees. A ripple of panic tore through the crowd as people turned, whispering and pointing. Shaq's heart slammed against his ribs. In an instant he swept her up in his arms, cradling her as if she were still a little girl, not a grown woman about to become a mother. Someone called 911. Someone screamed. Time blurred as paramedics arrived, forcing Shaq to relinquish Layla into their care. He tried to climb into the ambulance, but they gently pushed him back. Regulations, they said. There wasn't room. He followed in his truck, fists gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles blanched. At the hospital, everything spun faster. Doctors in green scrubs shouted orders. Nurses rushed past with clipboards and IV bags. Shaq wasn't used to being helpless. He was used to fixing things, making them right with sheer willpower. But here in these sterile halls filled with too bright lights and the smell of antiseptic, he could only stand there, a giant in a world that suddenly felt too small, too cruel. Layla underwent an emergency C-section. Shaq stood at the window, forehead pressed against the glass, watching the frenzy inside. He couldn't breathe until he heard the wail of a newborn, thin and furious, slicing through the chaos. A nurse cradled a tiny squirming bundle, her face hidden behind a surgical mask. Shaq felt a tear slip down his cheek. His granddaughter was here. His baby girl had brought another light into the world. They didn't let him hold her. Not yet. Protocol, they said again. Blood pressure issues, tests to run, precautions to take. Shaq nodded mutely, trying to trust them, trying to believe they knew what they were doing. He turned his gaze back to Layla, willing her to open her eyes, to see the beautiful life she'd created. But her chest rose and fell mechanically, tubes and wires snaking from her body. Machines beeped and whirred in an unforgiving rhythm. Shaq pressed his palm flat against the glass, whispering prayers he hadn't said since he was a boy. Minutes dragged into hours. Nurses bustled in and out, faces tight, movements clipped. Shaq sat in a plastic chair, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He didn't notice the woman standing down the hall at first, leaning casually against a vending machine, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. She wore scrubs, but something about her felt off. Too polished, too clean. Her badge was tilted just enough that he couldn't read the name. A strand of vivid red hair slipped from beneath her cap. She caught his eye and smiled, quick and tight, before disappearing down the corridor. Shaq's gut twisted. Something ancient and primal whispered inside him. Something he hadn't listened to often enough in his life. He stood scanning the hallway. But the woman was gone. Maybe a nurse. Maybe a volunteer. Maybe nothing. Still, he couldn't shake the unease curling in his stomach like smoke. Later, a nurse approached with a clipboard, her voice flat, clinical. The baby had been taken to the neonatal unit for additional monitoring, she said. Routine. Just a precaution. Shaq tried to follow, but they held up their hands, blocking his way like sentinels. Another wave of helplessness crashed over him. He stalked the halls like a caged animal, checking and rechecking the signs. NICU, Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. Authorized personnel only. He pressed his face against the narrow window, searching for a glimpse of his granddaughter. Nothing. At one point, a janitor pushing a mop cart paused beside him. You looking for a little baby girl? The old man asked, voice low. Ain't seen her come in. Usually we see him. Hear him too. Shaq frowned. She's supposed to be here. The janitor just shook his head and shuffled away. Panic gnawed at the edges of Shaq's mind, whispering terrible possibilities. He pushed it down, trusting the hospital, trusting the system. He sat back down, mind running circles around itself. Maybe he was overreacting. Maybe everything was fine. But when he closed his eyes, he saw that flash of red hair, that too bright smile. At 3 a.m., a doctor finally emerged. Fatigue etched deep into his features. Mr. O'Neill, he said carefully, we need to talk. Those 5 words twisted the knife deeper. The doctor ushered him into a grim little conference room. The walls painted a color that tried too hard to be cheerful. A social worker stood awkwardly in the corner, clutching a stack of pamphlets Shaq didn't want to see. Your daughter is stable but unresponsive, the doctor said. The coma, it's medically induced for now. We're monitoring swelling in her brain. Shaq nodded stiffly. Every word another hammer blow. And the baby? He rasped. The doctor exchanged a glance with the social worker. We're investigating. It appears, he swallowed. It appears the baby was taken from the hospital. The world tilted sideways. Shaq gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor himself. Taken? What the hell does that mean? It means, the social worker said, voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy, we believe your granddaughter was abducted. The rest of the words blurred together. Security footage missing. Witnesses, uncertain. Police already notified. Shaq stumbled out of the room, mind numb, heart breaking. He walked the halls in a daze, every door he opened slamming shut on another piece of hope. Nurses avoided his gaze. Security guards muttered into radios. Somewhere in this building, his granddaughter had been stolen away like a purse left unattended in a crowd, and he had done nothing to stop it. At sunrise, Shaq stood in the hospital parking lot, blinking against the brutal morning light. Reporters had started gathering, hungry for a story. Microphones thrust toward him, voices shouting questions he couldn't answer.
Where is the baby?
Was it an inside job? Does Big Shaq blame the hospital? He said nothing. He let the cameras capture his silence, his towering grief, his helpless fury. Somewhere, a woman with red hair cradled his granddaughter. Somewhere, she thought she had gotten away with it. She didn't know Big Shaq. She didn't know the storm she had just unleashed. And Shaq? He made a promise in that burning, broken moment. He would tear the city apart, brick by brick if he had to bring his granddaughter home. This wasn't over. Not even close. Back at the estate, the nursery waited. Shaq stepped inside, staring at the ghost of a future that now seemed so fragile. He ran his fingers along the crib's rail, his knuckles raw. The room smelled of lavender and new paint. He knelt by the tiny rocking chair, the one he had picked out after testing a dozen others in stores, determined to find the most comfortable seat to rock his granddaughter to sleep. He buried his face in the soft knit blanket, draped across it, and let the tears come. The media painted him as a tragic figure, grieving grandfather, broken hero. They dissected his life, dredging up old rumors, criticizing his parenting, questioning how something like this could happen under his watch. They smiled pityingly into their cameras, but Shaq saw the edges of judgment in their eyes. He knew the coded language they used when talking about families like his. He didn't have the luxury of sitting back and waiting for justice. With Layla in a coma, it fell to him to move mountains. He hired private investigators, spent hours reviewing hospital rosters and patient lists. He dug through security footage himself. piecing together fragments the authorities had missed. Somewhere in the chaos, the image sharpened. A woman, moving with calculated ease, blending into the background. The red hair haunted him. The city buzzed with rumors. Anonymous tips poured in, most useless, some malicious. A local barista claimed to have seen a woman with a newborn in a tattered hospital blanket. A bus driver swore he'd picked up a woman matching the description but couldn't recall where she got off. Each lead was a thread, and Shaq yanked them all, desperate for one to hold. He sat in unmarked cars parked outside laundromats and grocery stores, watching women come and go, praying for a flash of red hair, a bundle too tightly held. He ignored the growing whispers that maybe the baby was gone for good, that maybe the woman had already disappeared into the folds of the country, another ghost lost to an indifferent system. He refused to believe it. At a late-night community meeting, standing before a restless, grieving crowd, Shaq spoke from a place so raw that even the most jaded reporters wiped their eyes. He didn't speak about fame or fortune. He spoke about family, about how every child stolen was a wound on the soul of the nation, about how justice delayed was justice denied, about how he would burn every bridge, call in every favor, and fight with every breath until his granddaughter was found. People rose to their feet, clapping, shouting their support. For a brief, fierce moment, Shaq felt the tide shift. The community, their community, wasn't going to let this story fade into another forgotten headline. The authorities, now under public scrutiny, ramped up their efforts. Sketch artists produced a composite image of the suspect. Patrols doubled around bus stations, airports, train terminals. Shaq knew it still might not be enough. Whoever had taken his granddaughter wasn't just some desperate thief. She was calculating, methodical. She had prepared for this, and she had succeeded. For now. At home, the empty crib loomed larger. Every day, the nursery lights remained off, the mobile frozen mid-spin. Shaq sometimes caught himself standing in the doorway, imagining her there, tiny fingers gripping the air, little feet kicking against the mattress. He would close his eyes and listen, trying to hear a laugh that had never been given a chance to bloom. He never heard it. He fought despair with action. He organized volunteer search parties, handing out flyers with his granddaughter's face printed in bold letters. He appeared on talk shows, his deep voice shaking as he pleaded for tips. He haunted hospitals and police precincts, a constant reminder that he would not forget, that he would not let them forget. Somewhere out there, a woman rocked a child that wasn't hers, whispered lullabies into ears that should have been filled with the sound of family. Somewhere, she lived a lie, and Shaq swore she would not live it for long. The day he found her, the day he held his granddaughter in his arms, would come. He didn't know when. He didn't know how. But it would come. And when it did, the world would remember that Big Shaq, the man they tried to pity, the man they thought grief had broken, had never stopped fighting. Not for a single second. The hospital's sterile white walls, once symbols of healing and hope, now pulsed with something darker. Fear, guilt. Whispers slithered through the corridors like smoke, curling under doorframes, and nesting in the corners where nurses huddled and doctors traded clipped words. Everywhere Shaq turned, there were half-glances and unfinished sentences, the kind that reeked of secrets left to rot. The investigation into the missing infant was officially underway, but Shaq quickly realized that official meant slow, politicized, and riddled with cracks big enough to swallow the truth whole. Posters with the baby's image, blown up and plastered against every elevator door and bulletin board, already began to curl at the edges. Staff wore strained expressions as if they were hostages to the hospital's collapsing reputation, more worried about lawsuits and public relations than about the life stolen from their watch. Shaq moved through the hospital like a shadow, a towering reminder that they had failed. Some employees looked away when they saw him coming. Others offered plastic sympathy that made his skin crawl. The internal review team, a group of men and women in stiff suits, descended upon the hospital with clipboards and tablets, barking questions and ticking boxes as if solving a theft instead of a kidnapping. They spoke of process failures and communication breakdowns, dressing the horror in bureaucratic terms that stripped it of all humanity. Every update was the same. No progress, no answers, just apologies so rehearsed they sounded like bad theater. Shaq felt it brewing beneath the surface, the growing inclination to paint the incident as unavoidable, to cover their collective backs by shifting blame in 100 quiet ways. A missing file here, a blurred camera there, a nurse's hazy memory, conveniently forgetting crucial details. Each omission was a thread unraveling the truth, and Shaq saw it happening with terrifying clarity. He knew the game because he had lived it his whole life. Systems built to protect some while others were left to fend for themselves. Now, even with his fame, his fortune, and his face on every television screen in the country, the bias whispered its way back into the investigation, like a poison. The system didn't move quickly for people like him. Not when the victim was a black child, a child without the invisible armor of privilege. The realization hardened something inside Shaq, steeling his grief into a blade sharper than any anger he had ever felt. The first crack in the hospital's wall of silence came not from an administrator or a doctor, but from someone everyone else ignored. A janitor named Vernon Whitlock, older than the building itself, who pushed his mop along the marble floors with a quiet dignity that made him invisible to most. Shaq noticed him because he noticed everyone. It was part of who he was, part of who his mother had raised him to be. Vernon's eyes met Shaq's one evening as the hallway lights buzzed overhead, and there was a weight in that gaze, something urgent and unspoken. Shaq followed him without a word into a deserted stairwell, where the old man leaned heavily on his mop, glancing around before speaking in a voice rough with disuse. "She asked a lot of questions," Vernon muttered, staring at a crack in the concrete wall. "The redhead didn't look right, didn't sound right either, knew too much." Shaq's heart hammered against his ribs. Vernon told him about the woman, how she had wandered the maternity ward, casual as a tourist, how she had asked about visiting hours, security shifts, even emergency exits, how her smile was too practiced, how she carried herself like she belonged when she didn't. He had reported it, Vernon said, and told his supervisor, but nobody wanted to hear it. They had brushed him off, a janitor's gut feeling not enough to disrupt the smooth flow of hospital procedure. Now that oversight had become a gaping wound. Shaq listened, every detail branding itself into his mind. He thanked Vernon with a grip on the shoulder, and a solemn promise that his words wouldn't vanish into another forgotten file. He knew better than to trust the hospital's internal investigation to act on this information with any urgency. They would bury it, like they buried every other inconvenient truth. Shaq decided then and there he would not let his granddaughter's fate be dictated by a system designed to forget her. The next morning, he quietly began funding a private investigation, hiring a small team of experts whose only loyalty was to him. They weren't the suits favored by insurance companies and corporations. These were people who lived in the cracks, who knew how to dig where others refused. Veterans of missing persons cases, cold case warriors, cyber sleuths who could pull surveillance footage from corrupted drives and reconstruct timelines from scraps. Shaq gave them one mandate: find her. No excuses. No waiting for permission. The private team worked faster than anyone expected. They combed through hospital logs, cell tower pings, traffic cams within a 10-mile radius. They reconstructed the night of the abduction minute by painstaking minute. They uncovered discrepancies in staff schedules. A nurse who wasn't supposed to be on duty. A guard who took a break 10 minutes longer than logged. None of it felt like coincidence. Meanwhile, Shaq played his public role, grieving, pleading, appearing cooperative, while behind the scenes he moved pieces the authorities barely noticed. He attended every meeting with detectives and hospital administrators, nodding solemnly while they fed him platitudes, all the while collecting information, watching who sweated, who stumbled over their words. The tension between Shaq and the authorities grew with every passing day. Detectives bristled at his questions, at the way he refused to defer to their authority. Hospital officials treated him like a liability, a media firestorm waiting to erupt. Behind closed doors, Shaq knew they whispered that he was angry, uncooperative, difficult, the old words used to chain people like him to the margins. They didn't understand that Shaq was beyond anger now. He was focused, sharpened. Every ounce of sorrow had been forged into resolve. He started to notice subtle shifts. Hospital staff whispering as he passed, heads turning away, eyes darting nervously. An administrator who had once been warm, now barely concealed her contempt. Nurses who had offered awkward condolences, now crossed the hall to avoid him. The institution was closing ranks, sealing itself off against the storm he had become. The whispers carried to the media too. Anonymous sources close to the investigation hinted at family dysfunction, at domestic issues that might have contributed to hospital security failures. Shaq recognized the tactic immediately. The shifting of blame, the casting of shadows over the victims instead of holding the guilty accountable. He didn't care about the headlines. He didn't care about the smirking commentators, or the endless cycle of speculation. The only thing that mattered was the baby girl who had been stolen under their watch. The private investigators reported back with chilling news. In addition to Vernon's sighting, another hospital employee, a part-time intern who worked nights in records, had spotted a woman matching the redhead's description, exiting through a rarely used service door. Hospital logs showed no badge entry at that door that night. Someone had tampered with the system. The theory took shape. The abductor had inside knowledge, either a former employee or someone who had studied the hospital's procedures closely enough to mimic them. A professional move, not a crime of passion. Shaq paced the nursery that night, the stars and moons overhead casting shadows across the empty crib. He thought about the woman, about the audacity it took to steal a child from the heart of a hospital, to weave past cameras and security and leave without a trace. It was not just a crime, it was a message. You're not safe, not even when you think you are. He refused to let that be the final word. The team's next step was clear: trace every former employee with grievances against the hospital. Nurses let go for misconduct. Administrative staff terminated for breaches of protocol. Maintenance workers with spotty records. It was a needle in a haystack mission. But Shaq had time, money, and rage on his side. The cracks in the official investigation widened as Shaq's private team uncovered more inconsistencies, more deliberate cover-ups. They found emails between hospital executives discussing limiting liability exposure before they found evidence tracking the abductor's path. They found lawyers strategizing about damage control before they found the baby. The message was clear: the system was not built to save her. Shaq would have to do it himself. As he sat by Layla's bedside that night, her hand limp in his, he made another silent promise. He would not stop. He would not be silenced. His granddaughter's life would not be a footnote in a report, a cautionary tale buried under paperwork. She would be found. And when she was, the world would know exactly who had fought for her, who had torn down walls and broken through lies, and exposed the rot that had allowed her to be taken in the first place. Big Shaq wasn't going away. He was just getting started. The hum of the hospital's old security system was a low, persistent drone in the control room. Stale coffee and the sharp tang of burnt circuits perfumed the air. As two techs hunched over aging monitors, scrubbing through endless hours of footage, frame by agonizing frame, Big Shaq stood behind them, arms crossed, his shadow swallowing the small room whole. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, a storm bottled inside his towering frame. He hadn't been invited into the room. Officially, the footage review was restricted to law enforcement and hospital administration, but Shaq had long since stopped caring about rules designed to exclude him. He had pushed past the posted signs, stared down the weary security chief, and planted himself here until he saw the truth with his own eyes. The footage flickered, jittery and distorted, a visual stutter of hospital corridors under harsh fluorescent lights. The timestamp glowed 1:47 a.m. Just minutes after the last recorded sighting of his granddaughter. Shaq leaned closer, his massive hands pressing into the back of a battered chair. And there it was, a blur of movement at the edge of the screen. A woman, her face obscured by a surgical mask, pushing a cart loaded with linen bundles. The camera caught her only for a second, but the bright flash of red hair escaping her cap was unmistakable. The bundle cradled carefully against her chest was wrapped tight, too small, too precious to be hospital laundry. Shaq's heart kicked against his ribs with a ferocity that almost knocked him off balance. He forced himself to watch again, and again, every frame searing itself into his mind. The woman moved with chilling confidence, slipping through a staff-only door that should have required a keycard. No hesitation, no panic. She belonged there, or at least she wanted everyone to believe she did. One of the techs cleared his throat, fidgeting. Could be laundry, he mumbled, avoiding Shaq's burning gaze. Hospitals have a lot of linen movement at night. Shaq didn't bother dignifying the excuse. His gut, sharper now than ever, knew the truth. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones. That was no load of towels. That was his granddaughter, stolen like a secret in the dead of night. He demanded copies of the footage. They resisted. He insisted. Finally, the chief of security intervened with a reluctant nod, and a grainy flash drive changed hands. Shaq clutched it like a lifeline as he stormed from the room, his mind already racing. He brought the footage straight to the police, hoping that now they would act with urgency. Now they would throw every resource at finding the woman with the red hair. But hope, he learned once again, was a fragile thing easily crushed. At the precinct, The detectives assigned to the case viewed the footage with all the enthusiasm of a mandatory training seminar. They shrugged, exchanged glances, and jotted lazy notes on their pads. Their questions came slow, indifferent. Was Shaq sure it wasn't just a nurse? Could he think of any reason someone might want to frame the hospital? Was it possible, they asked, that stress and grief were clouding his judgment? The implication hung in the air, thick and rancid. Emotional black man, too unstable, too angry to think clearly. Shaq gritted his teeth, until his jaw ached. He had learned long ago that rage, while justified, was ammunition for those who wanted to dismiss him. Instead, he leaned into the weight of his grief, his voice steady, measured, deadly calm as he demanded action. They promised to look into it. Another promise thrown onto the pyre of all the others they had made, and broken. Shaq left the precinct with the knowledge that if he wanted justice, he would have to carve the path himself. He would not wait for a system that saw his granddaughter's life as negotiable, expendable, a tragedy more inconvenient than urgent. In the following days, the footage leaked. News outlets played the grainy clip on a loop, speculating breathlessly about the woman's identity. Internet detectives flooded forums with theories, dissecting every pixel of the footage. Some called her a disgruntled ex-employee, others spun wilder tales, human trafficking rings, black market adoption. But buried in the noise were darker undercurrents, cruel and insidious. Comment sections overflowed with insinuations. Maybe the family wasn't telling the whole story. Maybe they were involved somehow. Maybe it wasn't really a kidnapping at all. Shaq read it all, the poison sinking deep. He wasn't surprised. He had lived enough life to know how quickly compassion curdled into suspicion when the victim didn't look like the children on milk carts. He watched commentators on polished news desks smile with pity, while suggesting family dynamics needed to be investigated. He heard the dog whistles loud and clear, the way they questioned Layla's lifestyle, Shaq's past, his fame, his wealth, searching for a reason to shift blame onto them. He stayed silent in public, letting the storm rage around him, but inside he seethed. Every microaggression, every doubting glance, every veiled accusation was a stone added to the growing tower of injustice he carried on his back. And still, he moved forward. Shaq's private investigators dove deeper, following leads that law enforcement dismissed. They traced hospital employment records, hunting for anyone who matched the woman's description. They cross-referenced missing persons databases, social media posts, underground message boards. The trail was faint, fragmented, but a shape began to emerge from the fog. The woman wasn't just an opportunist. She had planned this for months, maybe longer. She had studied the hospital's routines, learned its blind spots. She knew when security rotated shifts, when cameras glitched, when protocol was thinnest. She wasn't hiding out of fear. She was confident, methodical, careful, and she had a head start. Every hour widened the gap between them. Every hour made the task of finding his granddaughter harder. But Shaq refused to surrender to despair. He worked his contacts, called in favors from old friends and new allies, former athletes, media personalities, community leaders. He pulled them all into the fight. Public pressure mounted. Petitions flooded City Hall. Activists marched outside the hospital, chanting the baby's name, demanding accountability. Still, the official investigation limped along, mired in bureaucracy and bias. Shaq could see the frustration even in the few officers who cared, the way their hands were tied by politics and policies designed to slow rather than solve. He didn't blame the few good ones caught in the machine, but he made it clear to anyone who would listen. He wasn't asking for their permission. He would bring his granddaughter home, with or without them. At night, the nursery loomed like a scar. Shaq would sit in the rocking chair he had chosen with such hope, staring at the crib, willing the universe to bend in his favor. The red mobile spun slowly above, casting shifting shadows across the walls. He pictured her growing up strong and stubborn like her mother, laughing with a mischievous glint in her eyes. He pictured teaching her to shoot free throws in the driveway, chasing her around the backyard, reading bedtime stories until she fell asleep, curled against his chest. He pictured it because he had to. Because to imagine anything else was to admit defeat. The glimpse of red hair became his anchor. It was proof that she was out there, proof that someone had seen her, held her, that she was not just a name in a report or a face on a poster. She was real, and she was coming home. Shaq made another vow to himself as he stared at the flickering footage for the 100th time. They could whisper their doubts, throw up their obstacles, drown him in bureaucratic sludge. It didn't matter. The system had failed them. Big Shaq would not. Not now. Not ever. And somewhere out there, a woman who thought she had gotten away with the perfect crime was about to learn what happened when you stole from a man who had already lost too much to lose quietly. The hunt was no longer passive. It was personal. The city shifted uneasily beneath the weight of Shaq's grief. It pulsed in the headlines, bled into the conversations held in barber shops and schoolyards, wormed its way into the late-night talk shows and Sunday sermons. People who had once seen Big Shaq as a towering figure of sports and laughter now glimpsed something deeper, more dangerous. A man stripped of everything but purpose. And purpose, when sharpened by loss, was a blade capable of cutting through the thickest lies. It was late on a Wednesday when the call came from his lead investigator, a woman named Sierra Langston, a former federal agent with a relentless instinct for ferreting out rot. Shaq sat in his truck outside the hospital, one hand wrapped around a lukewarm coffee, his body sagging with the exhaustion that only hope deferred could create. When he answered, Sierra's voice was crisp, charged with the kind of energy that had been missing for too long. They had a name: Roxanne Weaver, a former nurse at the hospital, fired 6 months prior under the smothering blanket of confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure threats. Officially, she had left for personal reasons. Unofficially, she had been caught stealing narcotics, manipulating patient records, and using her position to access restricted areas after hours. The administration had covered it up, quietly sweeping the scandal under the rug to protect the hospital's pristine reputation. Sierra had pieced it together through a network of whispers: disgruntled ex-employees, a payroll clerk too nervous to speak openly, a former supervisor who hinted at trouble but wouldn't put it in writing. In every account, one detail remained constant: Roxanne's striking red hair. Shaq gripped the steering wheel so hard it creaked under the pressure. The woman in the footage. The woman who had stolen his granddaughter. Her name had a weight now, and with it a trail to follow. Roxanne Weaver had disappeared from public life shortly after her firing, severing old ties and moving frequently. A woman living off the grid was harder to trace, but not impossible. Sierra was already pulling property records, old addresses, vehicle registrations. Somewhere in the debris of Roxanne's life was a clue to where she had gone, and where she had taken Shaq's granddaughter. Meanwhile, back inside the hospital's ICU, Layla's condition deteriorated. Machines that once beeped in steady rhythms now shrieked sudden alarms. Doctors spoke in low, urgent voices, words like complications and seizure risk, slipping out before they could be polished into something softer. Shaq stood vigil by her bed, a monolith of silent desperation. He studied her face, so still beneath the oxygen mask, her hands limp against the starched sheets. The woman who had once lit up every room she entered was now trapped somewhere between worlds. Unreachable. He talked to her anyway, murmuring promises and prayers, grounding himself in the rhythm of her shallow breaths. Every time a doctor avoided his eyes, every time a nurse hesitated before delivering news, Shaq felt the thin veneer of their assurances crack further. They were losing her, slowly, quietly, and he couldn't stop it. He carried that helplessness like a second skin. As he stepped onto the rally stage, 3 nights later, the city square thrumming with bodies and voices. Protest signs bobbed like restless waves in the crowd. Faces glistened with sweat and fury under the harsh lights. The search for his granddaughter had become more than a personal tragedy. It had become a symbol, a spark igniting long smoldering fires. Shaq gripped the microphone, feeling its weight. He didn't read from a script. He didn't need one. His voice, deep and ragged from sleepless nights, cut through the humid night air. He spoke of injustice, not just the theft of his family's future, but the thefts too many others had endured unnoticed. He spoke of systems that moved mountains for some but built walls for others. He spoke of the hollow apologies offered when black children went missing, the sluggish investigations, the whispered blame. The crowd responded with a roar that vibrated through the soles of his sneakers. Shaq's grief had become their grief. His fight, their fight. But this wasn't about anger for its own sake. This was about power, the power to force change, to refuse silence, to demand that the lives of black children be valued not in theory but in action. As he spoke, Shaq felt the mask of public expectation crumble, the smiling giant, the easygoing celebrity, the gentle giant narrative forced upon him for years. Beneath it stood the real man, scarred, furious, unbreakable. He vowed to the crowd that night, and to himself that no matter what happened, he would not allow the world to move on without reckoning. There would be no comfortable forgetting, no soft closure, only the relentless pursuit of truth. In the days that followed, tips flooded Sierra's team. Most were dead ends, sightings of red-haired women who turned out to be innocent, anonymous calls made by attention seekers. But one lead sparked brighter than the rest: a rental property on the outskirts of Gainesville. Paid in cash, no formal lease, the tenant matched Roxanne Weaver's description. She had arrived 3 months ago with a baby, the neighbors said, claiming to be a new mother fleeing an abusive relationship. Shaq listened to the report with fists clenched, every nerve vibrating with restrained energy. He didn't rush in blind. He knew the dangers of a misstep, of letting emotion override strategy. He let Sierra's team surveil the property, building a case brick by careful brick. Photographs confirmed it. Roxanne Weaver, moving about the small yard with a baby carrier, tucked protectively against her body. The glimpses of the infant were fleeting, obscured by blankets and distance. But Shaq didn't need a DNA test to know. He knew it was her, his granddaughter, alive. The knowledge burned through him, a wildfire of hope and fury tangled so tightly he could hardly breathe. Yet even now, obstacles loomed. The property was isolated. Local law enforcement was reluctant to act without ironclad evidence, and the bureaucratic gears of warrants and custody battles churned slower than molasses in winter. There were whispers that Roxanne had friends in powerful places, relatives connected to hospital administration, old favors owed, and called in. Shaq's team warned him that even if they reached the child, the legal battle could be brutal, that Roxanne might have manipulated paperwork to claim custody, that the courts might not move quickly enough to prevent her from disappearing again. But Shaq was no longer a man, content with playing by the rules designed to fail him. He mapped every path forward: the legal, the strategic, the personal. Publicly, he kept up appearances meetings with detectives, staged press conferences, polite pleas for continued investigation. Privately, he prepared for the inevitable confrontation. At the hospital, Layla clung to life with the stubbornness that ran through her bloodline. Some days, Shaq swore he saw her fingers twitch, her eyelids flutter. Doctors remained cautious, hedging every glimmer of hope with warnings of setbacks. He needed her to wake up. He needed her to see that he had kept his promise, that he had not let the world swallow their future whole. The city, too, seemed to teeter on the brink. The rallies grew larger, angrier. Local news anchors spoke in strained tones about maintaining peace. But the undercurrent of rage was undeniable. People were tired of mourning, tired of being told to wait, to trust a system that had never seen them. Shaq harnessed that fury, wielding it like a hammer against the walls of complacency. Every speech he gave, every interview he agreed to, every tear he let fall on national television, was a weapon aimed at the heart of indifference. The crumbling mask of respectability politics could no longer contain him. He had seen what happened when you played nice, when you trusted promises instead of demanding results. Somewhere in that quiet rental house on the edge of nowhere, Roxanne Weaver rocked a child that was not hers, built a life atop a foundation of theft and lies. But her time was running out. Shaq would see to that. The storm he had become was no longer something she could outrun. And when the mask finally shattered completely, when the lies lay in ruins at their feet, the world would see the truth in all its brutal, undeniable glory. There would be no more hiding, no more pretending. Only justice, real, raw, and unstoppable. And he was still so agonizingly far away. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel, fighting the surge of helpless rage. There was no storming in, no righteous confrontation. Not yet. Every move had to be legal, precise, airtight. If they acted too soon without the full machinery of the law behind them, Roxanne could slip away again, and this time, she would vanish for good. Sierra's team was working to secure an emergency custody order. They had engaged every contact, filed every affidavit, pushed every legal lever they could find. But even the fastest motions crawled compared to the desperate ticking inside Shaq's mind. Each minute was a gamble. He pulled out the thick file Sierra had given him and flipped through the photographs again. Images of Roxanne's hollow smiles, the backyard barbecues she staged for appearances, the moments caught where her mask slipped and fear bled through. Pictures of the child bundled in blankets, face turned away from the camera, a precious life treated like contraband. There was no perfect crime, only imperfect people, desperate enough to believe in it. The neighbors spoke glowingly of Roxanne. In interviews conducted by Sierra's team, they described her as sweet, a little nervous, but dedicated. No one questioned the sudden appearance of a newborn. No one pried too deeply. In communities built on the currency of appearances, the less you questioned, the better. Shaq marveled grimly at how easily Roxanne had manipulated their instincts. A white woman, with a tragic story, a miracle baby, a narrative so ready-made that no one had bothered to scratch the surface. It was a mirror held up to every system he had ever fought against, a reminder of how quickly empathy was weaponized for some and withheld from others. He wondered if anyone would have believed his pain as easily if the roles were reversed. The pressure cooker tightened with each passing hour. The baby, now nearly 3 months old, was bonding with her captor in ways that no amount of rescue could fully undo. Psychologists warned of attachment trauma, identity confusion. Even if Shaq won the legal battle, the scars would remain, shadows cast over milestones that should have been pure. He imagined the day his granddaughter would learn the truth, that her first memories, her first laughs, her first steps had been stolen, that the arms she trusted most in her earliest days had belonged to a liar. Shaq would have to walk her through that fire someday, hold her hand while she made sense of the betrayal she never asked for. It fueled him, not just the need to reclaim her, but to rebuild everything Roxanne had tried to destroy. Back at the hospital, Layla's condition plateaued. No worse, no better. A cruel stasis that offered no comfort. Shaq divided his time between her bedside and stakeouts, between whispered prayers and cold, calculated strategy sessions. The fight consumed every cell of his being, leaving no space for rest, no tolerance for doubt. The break finally came in the form of a careless mistake, a lapse Roxanne must have thought herself too clever to make. Sierra's tech team intercepted a digital purchase made with a fake identity tied to her. A birth certificate ordered from an online vendor, notorious for peddling forged documents. It was all the confirmation they needed. Sierra's legal team sprang into action, pushing the evidence to sympathetic judges, cutting through red tape with the blunt force of overwhelming proof. Within 24 hours, they secured an emergency court order authorizing the removal of the child from Roxanne Weaver's custody pending a full investigation. It wasn't the endgame, but it was the beginning of the end. Shaq exhaled for the first time in what felt like weeks. The walls were closing in, not around him, but around her. Roxanne's perfect life was a sandcastle built at low tide, and the ocean was coming for her. Still, Shaq knew better than to underestimate desperation. Roxanne had gambled everything on this fantasy, and cornered people did foolish, dangerous things. The team planned the operation with clinical precision. Law enforcement would approach first, calm and professional, citing the court order. The goal was to minimize risk, to avoid any chance of a scene that could traumatize the baby further. Shaq would wait nearby, unseen, a silent force brimming with hope and dread. The hours leading up to the operation stretched like an eternity. Shaq sat in the darkened car, muscles locked, staring at the house through binoculars. The baby was there. He could feel it in his bones. Soon, very soon, he would hold her. Soon, the lies would fall away. And beneath the ruin of the perfect life Roxanne had built on stolen dreams, Shaq would reclaim the only thing that mattered. Family, truth, everything she thought she had buried beneath the white picket fences and painted smiles. The air hung thick with the scent of candle wax and tension as the vigil began. 1,000 points of trembling light dotted the city square, held in shaking hands, casting golden halos on faces hardened by anger and grief. News vans lined the curb, satellite dishes craning upward like skeletal arms. Reporters whispered into microphones, their voices swallowed by the hum of a crowd that had gathered not just to mourn but to demand. At the center of it all stood Shaq, his massive frame wrapped in a simple gray hoodie, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He was no longer the gentle giant, smiling in commercials, no longer the face of a brand, or the voice of a franchise. Tonight he was simply a man who had been robbed, standing naked before the world in his grief and fury. The authorities had not moved quickly enough. Despite the emergency custody order, procedural delays, jurisdictional battles, and bureaucratic stalling had cracked open a gap wide enough for Roxanne to slip through if she sensed the noose tightening. Every lawyer Shaq spoke to painted the same grim picture. Even with everything they had gathered, even with undeniable evidence, the wrong misstep could allow Roxanne to vanish into a system that had always been too slow, too forgiving to those who knew how to play it. Shaq couldn't afford that risk. He needed her to come to him. The vigil was a gamble, a desperate, calculated move to pull her from the shadows, to provoke her into action. They hadn't publicized the surveillance breakthroughs. As far as the world knew, Shaq was still a man lost in grief, pleading for answers, begging the public to care. It had to feel real to Roxanne. It had to feel like he was vulnerable, still stumbling in the dark. And so he stood on the hastily erected stage, clutching a worn photo of his granddaughter, the same image printed on every flyer, every poster. His voice when he spoke was raw, ragged, soaked in months of agony. He talked about the baby's first breath, her tiny fists clenching instinctively. He talked about dreams unfinished, memories unwritten. He painted a future stolen by the hands of someone who thought they could rewrite another family's story and walk away unscathed. He spoke of forgiveness not offered, of wounds too deep to heal with apologies. Each word was a lure, bait dropped carefully into the churning sea of media coverage and public spectacle. In the crowd, Sierra's team watched from strategic positions, eyes scanning for any sign of her. Cameras captured every face. Nothing left to chance. Shaq's heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a drum of anticipation. Somewhere out there, he believed, Roxanne was listening, watching. She had to be. A woman who had risked everything for the illusion of motherhood would not be able to resist the pull of attention, the gnawing fear of discovery. He finished his speech with a simple statement, one that pierced through the gathering dusk like a blade. I will not stop until she's home. The crowd roared. Candles lifted higher. Shaq stepped down from the stage, his legs heavy but his mind sharper than it had ever been. Now came the waiting. He stayed visible for hours, working the crowd, hugging strangers who wept against his chest, holding trembling hands, every interaction carefully choreographed, a dance designed to signal one thing: vulnerability. All the while, Sierra's people sifted through surveillance footage in real time, matching faces, flagging anything unusual. Hours passed. Nothing. The night grew colder, thinner. Families drifted away, cradling their candles like fragile promises. News vans packed up. The roar of the crowd faded into a whisper of footsteps on concrete. Still, Shaq waited. And then, just as the last vendor dismantled his cart, a ripple moved through the thinning crowd. A woman, hovering at the edges, her hair tucked beneath a wool cap, sunglasses perched awkwardly despite the darkness. She cradled a bundled object against her chest. Not the baby, but a heavy sweatshirt clutched as if it were armor. Sierra's team snapped into motion, subtle and controlled. No sudden moves, no flashing lights. Shaq's gaze locked onto the figure, his instincts roaring to life. It wasn't definitive. It could be anyone. Another grieving mother, another broken soul, drawn to the gravity of tragedy. But something in the way she moved, jerky, too deliberate, sent alarms shrieking through his mind. She lingered near the stage, watching Shaq with a hunger that was almost palpable. A whisper buzzed in his earpiece. A match on facial recognition, 72% certainty. Close enough. Shaq turned, making a show of vulnerability. He let his shoulders slump, his head hang, as if crushed by the weight of defeat. The woman edged closer. Sierra's team closed the perimeter silently, a noose tightening without a sound. The woman reached into her sweatshirt, fumbling, pulling something free, a small laminated card. A photo. Shaq's heart stopped. It was a picture of the baby, younger, bundled in a hospital-issued blanket, her tiny face puckered in sleep. The woman held it up like an offering, trembling. It was all the confirmation Shaq needed. The authorities moved in seconds later, sweeping the woman up in a blur of quiet commands and careful hands. No struggle, no screams, just a small, broken woman sinking to the ground, cradling her empty sweatshirt, her illusion shattering into 1,000 pieces under the floodlights. Shaq stood frozen, his body numb, his mind struggling to process the sight. It wasn't over. The real recovery, the retrieval of the baby, was still ahead. But tonight they had severed the head of the lie. They had ripped away the mask. The woman, Roxanne Weaver, sobbed as she was led away, but Shaq heard none of it. His world had narrowed to a single point. A single goal. Find the baby. Bring her home. The vigil ended in a storm of flashing lights and urgent voices. But Shaq barely noticed. He drifted through the chaos, untouchable, his mind already moving to the next battle. Because Roxanne had not brought the baby with her, which meant someone else still had her. And time, That merciless thief was running out again. The desperate gamble had paid off, but the true war was only just beginning. Shaq vowed, as the last candle sputtered out at his feet, that he would see it through to the end. No matter what it cost him, no matter how long it took. Because some battles were not fought for victory. Some were fought because surrender was never an option. It wasn't a protest of rage. It was a gathering of truth. A flood of faces carrying candles and photographs, and signs bearing the names of the forgotten. People who knew the weight of stolen children, stolen futures, stolen dignity. Shaq spoke not just for his family now, but for every family who had been told to be patient while justice died of old age. The march swept through the city like a tidal wave. Impossible to ignore. Streets closed. News helicopters thudded overhead. Social media exploded with live streams and hashtags, the movement growing bigger than anyone could have predicted. And when Shaq stood on the marble steps of City Hall, he was not alone. He carried the weight of thousands behind him. He gripped the podium, a simple wood structure that suddenly seemed as fragile as the illusions the city clung to. The sun glared off the white stone, casting hard shadows across the crowd. Shaq's voice didn't tremble when he spoke. It didn't roar either. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. A quiet, relentless certainty. He told them about Randall Pike, about the baby ripped from her rightful home and hidden like a shameful secret. He named the officials who had slowed the investigation, who had dragged their feet while a stolen child vanished deeper into the cracks of the city. He spoke without accusation, without profanity, without theatrics. Just fact, undeniable, uncomfortable, unrelenting. He told the city the truth. It had spent decades trying not to see that some lives were not considered worth saving, until their absence became inconvenient to ignore. The crowd didn't scream. They didn't chant. They stood in silence, thousands of breaths held together, the weight of truth pressing down harder than any anthem. Reporters captured every second. National networks broke into regular programming to carry the speech live. Politicians' phones exploded with calls. Judges who had dismissed Shaq's filings with a shrug now scrambled to return them. The machine couldn't protect itself from a spotlight that bright. And somewhere in the city, Randall Pike felt the ground shift under his feet. Pressure mounted from every direction. Anonymous tips poured in. Randall's trailer was located, a dilapidated mess crouching at the edge of a dried-up creek. Witnesses reported a baby's cry heard in the nights, muffled and sharp. Shaq didn't go with the officers when they raided the trailer. He stood back, fists clenched, staring at the peeling paint and sagging porch. He wouldn't taint this moment with rage or reckless hunger. He would wait for the truth to emerge. It didn't take long. The officers emerged minutes later, cradling a tiny bundle against one of their chests, wrapped tight in a grimy hospital blanket. Shaq's knees buckled. The world tilted. But he held steady, swallowing the sob that clawed up his throat, forcing himself to stay upright, until the officers approached. Even before he saw her face, he knew. The baby squirmed, her tiny fists punching the air, her cries sharp and furious. Alive. Real. Home. The moment shattered something inside him and rebuilt it all at once. The months of helplessness, of rage and despair, all condensed into this single point of unbearable clarity. He reached out, hands trembling for the first time he could remember, and the officer gently placed her into his arms. She was lighter than he remembered, smaller, but she was here, safe. Shaq pressed his forehead to hers, his body shaking with silent, racking sobs. The crowd erupted behind him, not with cheers, but with a roar of release, a tidal wave of emotion too big to be contained. Justice had not been served by the system. It had been dragged into existence by the relentless will of a man who refused to be silent. Shaq knew there would still be battles ahead, court hearings, therapy sessions, nightmares that wouldn't fade overnight. But for now, none of that mattered. He had her. He had kept his promise. And as the sun began to set behind the crumbling facade of City Hall, Shaq whispered a silent vow to the tiny heartbeat pressed against his chest. They would never steal from them again. Not this city. Not this system. Not anyone. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and cold fear. Shaq stood in the hallway, the drone of legal proceedings bleeding through the heavy oak doors. The fight was supposed to be over. He had found her, cradled her in his arms, held the tremor of her heartbeat against his chest. But the world wasn't that simple. The law demanded its rituals, its proofs, its endless parade of signatures and approvals, dragging hope through a gauntlet of red tape. Across the polished floor, Randall Pike shuffled in cuffs, his eyes darting everywhere but at Shaq. Roxanne Weaver sat rigid in a stiff-backed chair, her face hollowed out by weeks of interrogation and public disgrace. Her once vibrant red hair hung limp and lifeless against her shoulders. The courts had moved faster than anyone expected, the tidal wave of public pressure too powerful for even entrenched corruption to resist. The DNA tests had been the final nail, indisputable and cold. The baby girl was Layla's daughter, Shaq's granddaughter, flesh of their flesh, blood of their blood. Yet the victory felt strangely muted, as Shaq carried the sleeping child into the final hearing. The real war hadn't been about winning a courtroom battle. It had been about the silent damage inflicted during every hour of separation, every whispered lie, every stolen moment that could never be recovered. The judge's voice rolled through the chamber, dry and final, granting full custody to Shaquille O'Neal and the legal guardianship necessary to act until Layla's recovery. The gavel fell like a gunshot, and just like that, the legal nightmare ended. But it wasn't the echo of the gavel Shaq would remember most. It was the tiny sigh from the bundle in his arms, the way she snuggled deeper against his chest, oblivious to the war that had been fought in her name. The courthouse steps erupted with flashing cameras and shouted questions. Reporters surged forward, hungry for a headline, for a tearful quote, for a glimpse of redemption. Shaq ignored them all. He moved like a glacier through the chaos, the baby protected within the shield of his arms. Sierra and her team cleared a path to the waiting car, their faces grim and watchful. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Shaq finally exhaled. The city blurred past the window, a smear of neon and noise. But inside the car, a fragile peace settled. The baby stirred, blinking up at him with wide, unknowing eyes, her tiny hand curling instinctively around his finger. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Shaq allowed himself to believe it. She was safe. Home. But the storm inside him hadn't passed. It had only changed direction. He wasn't just a grandfather anymore. He was a guardian, a shield, a living promise. The city's wounds would not heal easily. Corruption didn't vanish because it had been shamed once. The systems that had allowed this to happen still rotted beneath the surface, waiting for attention to drift away, for people to grow tired and move on. Shaq wouldn't let them. Not while breath still filled his lungs. At the hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic greeted him, like an old enemy. The halls were quieter now, the chaos of the early days replaced with a tense, waiting calm. Shaq moved through them with a single-minded focus, ignoring the curious glances, the awkward nods. Layla's room sat at the end of a long corridor, the door half open. Inside, the machines still whirred and beeped, an uneven symphony of survival. Shaq stood in the doorway, cradling the baby against his chest, his heart pounding a violent rhythm. He whispered a silent prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the universe itself, a plea for one more miracle. He stepped into the room. Layla lay motionless, her face too pale, her body too still. The baby whimpered softly, sensing the change in the air, the connection that memory had not erased. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, with a shudder so slight it might have been imagined, Layla's fingers twitched against the sheet. Shaq froze. Another twitch. Stronger this time. The monitors blipped in excitement, nurses rushing in with urgent whispers. Shaq backed against the wall, clutching the baby tighter, afraid to hope, terrified to believe. Layla's eyelids fluttered. Her head shifted on the pillow, her brow furrowing against the bright lights overhead. And then slowly, painfully, she opened her eyes. The room contracted to a single point of focus, the bond between mother and daughter stretching across the impossible distance of coma and kidnapping and despair. Tears streamed unchecked down Shaq's face as he watched Layla's gaze sharpen, confusion warring with recognition. The baby cooed, reaching blindly toward the bed, her tiny body wriggling in Shaq's arms. A nurse leaned over, her voice gentle, explaining, anchoring Layla to the present with words and touch. Shaq didn't need translation. He saw at the moment Layla understood. The sob that ripped from her throat was raw, primal, devastating. Her arms reached out instinctively, trembling with weakness, desperate to reclaim the piece of herself that had been stolen. Shaq stepped forward, his legs almost giving out beneath him, and placed the baby gently in Layla's arms. Mother and daughter clung to each other, a knot of life and sorrow and impossible hope. The room disappeared. The world disappeared. There was only this. This reunion. This miracle. It was messy. It was broken. It was perfect. Shaq turned away, wiping his face with the sleeve of his hoodie, his shoulders heaving with the release of months of grief and rage and terror. They had survived. Somehow, against every force stacked against them, they had survived. The days that followed blurred into a new kind of battle, one fought in hospital hallways and therapy rooms, in courtrooms, in council meetings. Shaq didn't rest. He couldn't. Layla's recovery was slow, painful, but steady. Each day she regained a little more of herself, and with it, the future that had been hanging by a thread. Shaq spoke at town halls and on national television. He met with lawmakers and civil rights leaders, forging alliances built on shared fury and stubborn hope. He pushed for reforms in hospital security, for transparency in missing child investigations, for accountability in every institution that had failed his family. He refused to let his granddaughter's story become a cautionary tale. It would be a rallying cry. The city changed under the pressure. Not fast enough, not deep enough, but it changed. Policies shifted. Heads rolled, new faces took the places of old ones, bringing fresh promises to the table. And through it all, Shaq kept coming back to that hospital room, to the nursery at home slowly filling with life again, to the soft weight of his granddaughter asleep against his chest. He built his days around her, feeding, rocking, singing in a voice rough with exhaustion and wonder. Every tiny milestone, every gurgled laugh, every first uncertain step was a victory, reclaimed from the jaws of despair. Layla watched from her wheelchair, her eyes bright with fierce pride, her hands trembling slightly but her spirit unbroken. She worked harder than anyone should have to, pushing her body to heal, to be strong again for the daughter who needed her. Shaq saw it in her, the same fire that had carried him through seasons of triumph and defeat, the same unyielding refusal to bow to a world that had tried to break them. They were O'Neills. They endured. They fought. They rose. And as the months wore on, as the seasons changed, as laughter and hope seeped back into the cracks left by tragedy, Shaq understood something he hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't just a personal victory. This was a statement, a warning, a promise to every system that thought it could grind families like his into dust, to every person who believed grief would silence them, to every lie built on the backs of stolen lives. They were still standing, still fighting, still here, and they would never be invisible again. The mornings at the O'Neill house were no longer ruled by silence. They were filled with soft cries and the sweet, chaotic noise of life returning. In the kitchen, the smell of pancakes battled the sharp bite of freshly brewed coffee. The sun rose over the backyard basketball court. Shaq had once dominated with his towering presence, now dwarfed by something far more powerful. The sight of his granddaughter, clumsily learning to toddle on unsteady legs, giggling in defiance of everything that had once tried to steal her away. The scars were still there, woven deep into the fabric of their lives. Shaq saw them in Layla's hesitant glances when strangers cooed at the baby in public, in the way her hand would instinctively tighten on the stroller handle, as if anchoring her daughter to the earth. He saw them in the baby too, subtle but undeniable, a lingering wariness whenever an unfamiliar face leaned too close. The wounds left behind by betrayal didn't vanish with a court order or a DNA test. They lingered, invisible yet heavy. Shaq carried his own scars as well. They showed up in the way he scanned every room instinctively, calculating exits, evaluating threats. They etched themselves into the lines around his eyes. The way he hunched slightly over the stroller, as if daring the world to try to take her again. No matter how many times the doctors assured him that the baby was healthy, thriving even, the doubt remained, a shadow stitched to the soles of his feet. But for every scar, there was also healing. The nursery, once a monument to loss, had transformed into a sanctuary of color and sound. Hand-painted murals lined the walls, new ones Layla insisted on creating herself once she regained enough strength to hold a brush. The mobile above the crib spun gently, its music a soft background to a life rebuilt day by day. Shaq watched them, the two halves of his heart grow stronger with each sunrise. Layla's laugh returned, cautious at first, then bold and reckless, scattering across the rooms like confetti. The baby's milestones came fast and furious, each one a thunderous victory. First steps, first words, first real belly laugh, that had Shaq falling to his knees in the living room, overcome with the simple, breathtaking sound of hope. But outside their walls, the world remained complicated, unfinished. The media frenzy died down eventually, as it always did, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher scandals. Public sympathy shifted like sand, moving on to the next viral story. The officials who had hindered the investigation issued hollow apologies, careful not to admit liability but eager to cleanse their reputations in the court of public opinion. Shaq refused to let the lessons be forgotten. He established the O'Neill Foundation for Justice, a nonprofit dedicated to reforming missing persons investigations and supporting families trapped in the limbo of systemic failure. He used every ounce of his influence, every scrap of goodwill and fame he had earned, to amplify voices too often drowned out. He gave speeches not in tailored suits on polished stages, but in community centers and churches, under leaking roofs and flickering lights, standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had known the same grief, the same invisible battles. He spoke about Layla, about his granddaughter, about the cracks in the systems that promised protection but delivered excuses. He told their story not for sympathy, but as a warning, as a call to action. His words carried weight, rooted not in celebrity, but in scars earned the hard way. Slowly, change rippled outward. Legislation was proposed, demanding faster response times for missing children of color, mandating independent oversight of hospital security breaches. A task force was created to review systemic failures in child abduction cases. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't enough, but it was more than there had been before. And it was a start. Shaq understood now that healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about carrying it forward, reshaping it into something that served a purpose beyond personal survival. His pain became a weapon, not of destruction, but of creation. He built alliances with activists who had spent their lives shouting into the void. He listened to mothers who had buried empty coffins, to fathers who had lost their sons to systems that never even learned their names. He learned how to use his platform not as a shield but as a spotlight, exposing rot, demanding reckoning. At home, Layla flourished. Her strength returned not in a rush, but in waves, each one crashing a little higher than the last. She resumed her work at the community center she loved, advocating for young mothers, teaching them not just parenting skills, but how to navigate a world too quick to judge them, too slow to help them. She became a symbol herself, not of victimhood, but of survival, of resilience crafted from ashes. Her daughter grew into a fierce, fearless toddler, her tiny fists always reaching, grasping, exploring. She loved to sit in Shaq's lap, yanking at his beard with gurgling laughter, oblivious to the battles fought on her behalf. She would grow up knowing the truth, not shielded from it, but armed by it. They didn't pretend the scars weren't there. They acknowledged them, honored them, used them as roadmaps to navigate the future. Shaq spent quiet evenings on the back porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, his granddaughter curled against his chest, Layla's laughter drifting through the screen door. He thought about everything they had lost, everything they had fought to reclaim. He knew the world hadn't changed enough. He knew the battles would continue. He knew another family, somewhere, was even now entering their own nightmare. But he also knew something deeper now. Love, real, fierce, stubborn love, could outlast even the cruelest betrayals. It could withstand the slow erosion of injustice, the sharp edges of prejudice, the cold indifference of broken systems. Love healed not by erasing scars, but by making them part of the story, a story that refused to end in tragedy. A story still being written with every sunrise. Shaq stood, lifting his granddaughter high above his head, her laughter ringing out like a bell, cutting through the twilight. She reached for the stars with pudgy, fearless hands. And Shaq, for the first time in a long time, reached with her. Because no matter how broken the world remained, no matter how many scars they carried, they had proven one thing beyond any doubt. They were still standing, still fighting, still loving. And that would always, always be enough. When stories like this get buried, injustice wins. Stand with those who refuse to be silenced. Carry the fight forward in your conversations, in your communities, in every choice you make, because sometimes the loudest victories come from those who simply refuse to look away. Stay part of the movement that turns pain into power.